Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Welcome to our program. How do you negotiate race and racism in your life? This week we talk with anti-racist author Tim Wise and hear from New Orleans public school students who are taking back their schools. All that and a few words from me on security forces that stink. It's all coming up right here. Stay tuned. Why should we be concerned about economic disparity? Our next guest, anti-racism activist and writer Tim Wise, says we're living in a culture of cruelty, one in which we celebrate the excessively rich while shaming and punishing the poor. Wise's anti-racism work traces back to his days as a college activist in the 80s, fighting for divestment from apartheid South Africa. He also worked as the youth coordinator and associate director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and a community organizer in New Orleans public housing. He's the author of 6 books, most notably his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. His latest book, Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America, is out this month. Welcome to the program, Tim. Glad to have you back.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
So let's start with this question of cruelty. Describe a little bit what you mean by the culture of cruelty that we live with.
Well, I mean by that, if you look at the history of, let's say, the last 80 years, go back 75, 80 years ago, what was interesting is that in the wake of the Depression, at least insofar as white folks were concerned, this country became an incredibly, I'm not going to say generous, but certainly more forbearing nation with regard to poor folks. We understood that the market didn't work. We understood the state had a role to play in providing jobs and housing and all of those things. And it was something that most average Americans supported. And that really remained the case all through the 40s, all through the 50s, FHA loans, GI Bill, VA loans. Only when people of color came to be seen as the public face of government programs did that switch. And since that time, we've heard the rhetoric of cruelty, the rhetoric of shaming the poor, the rhetoric of a culture of poverty having trapped people and how government somehow has made them dependent. So this isn't the rhetoric of 70 years ago, but it is now.
How different is that than what we've seen in other countries? Because certainly when it comes to inequality and disparity, Thomas Piketty, lots of others have pointed out this is kind of a global issue.
If you look at the countries of Europe where some of these same phenomena are playing out, I would say the root of it is very similar. It's interesting. Go back to the 70s when Margaret Thatcher was running to be the head of state in the UK. She was not campaigning on getting rid of the NHS. She did not say we're going to get rid in Great Britain of National Health Service. Yes, the Conservative Party wanted to make it more efficient. They wanted to do all kinds of changes, but it was understood as something that Brits took for granted that was important and valuable. Now there is real talk there and in Germany and all throughout Western European nations who were and Northern European nations known for, Scandinavian countries known for their social welfare programs, about maybe we should rethink this. Well, why are they doing that? I would suggest one of the reasons is that as immigrants from North Africa, as immigrants from the so-called Middle East have come into those countries, now you have these white folks who are saying, oh wait, you mean it's not just going to be my cousin or my family or people like me, it's the same thing that's happening in the US. So I would suggest that some of the pushback against social welfare safety nets is there as well as here, connected to the feeling, the perception, often very inaccurate, that people of color are the ones who are taking advantage of or abusing the program.
Do you have your favorite example of cruelty? Because some of the quotes in your book are just stomach-turning.
Well, I mean, as one example, and this was important to me because as you mentioned in the setup, I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. So in the wake of Katrina, like a lot of folks who had been there, I know people who've been displaced still have not been able to get back, know people who lost friends and family. And at the time, there was a lot of rhetoric. And I think this is where I saw a lot of the cruelty ramped up because for about 48 hours, there seemed to be an outpouring of national sympathy. People were stunned. They were shocked that we would leave people behind. Now, I would argue Black New Orleanians weren't shocked at all. They had been left behind, moved around, displaced, generation in and generation out. But in the wake of that, after about 72 hours, 96 hours, a week later, all of a sudden, we saw this real turn in the mood, and conservative talk show hosts started talking about the people there as if they were parasites. Neil Bortz, a very prominent right-wing talk show host and writer, actually said that. He said they were vermin, they were leeches, they were parasites, they were toenail fungus of America, and that they, sat on their asses, he said, when the storm came and didn't want to leave because they were waiting for their welfare check. Not only was that incredibly cruel and demeaning, it was also false results, because at the time of Katrina, there were 132,000 households, at least in the city, only 4,500 of which received any form of cash welfare. So the percentage of people in New Orleans who were actually receiving the so-called generous benefits of the welfare state was very small, but that became the narrative. And to me, when you are bashing people who were literally, before the city had even been rebuilt, people displaced, it really takes cruelty, to a whole new level.
Yeah. Now, we could talk a lot about similar examples, and you have a lot in your book, and this whole question of culture, and you talk a lot about the role of the media. But I would love to go back to something you said at the beginning about the structure of our economy and its relationship to racism. We've had Scott Nakagawa on this program talking about the way that slavery was how we built capitalism in America. As an anti-racist yourself, how do you see those connections?
Well, I think that's very accurate to say that. I mean, in the book, what I try to trace out is the somewhat unique way in which the class system in the U.S. developed, as opposed to other nations. The point that I try to make, is if you think about sort of old feudal monarchies of Europe, the thing was, if you were poor, if you were a peasant, if you were working class, you knew it. You knew you weren't going to be nobility. You were never going to have wealth and riches unless there was a revolution. You were going to die a peasant, just as you had been born. In this country, we have two things, quote unquote, going for us, which actually make it very hard to create economic justice. One is that myth of meritocracy that says everybody can make it if they just work hard. So now the peasant thinks, well, I don't have to be a peasant. If I just double down and work 60 hours a week, maybe 70, then I'll be rich one day. And then the second thing is that we've had this system of racial caste and white supremacy, which has told the white worker that, you may not have much, but at least you're not black, or at least you're not indigenous, or at least you're not Mexican, or at least you're not Chinese labor working on the railroads. We will elevate you, not much, because we are rich and we don't like you poor white folks either, but we like you enough to make you think you're part of the team. And so I trace out that history in the book and showing how the elite, turned working class white folks against working class and poor African peoples and Latino folk and Asian folk, going all the way back to the colonies as a way to cement what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, being a wage that, you may not have a lot of money, you certainly don't have wealth, but you have the ability to think to yourself that you're special because you have this particular skin.
So if it's so systemic, how do we uproot it?
Well, I think part of it is we have to be honest about the cause of that inequality. Most of the time when people in the United States on the left talk about dealing with economic injustice, they leave this part out about the centrality of race. And I think by doing that, not only is it dishonest, it makes it very difficult to build coalitions. If you're going to build a coalition to create a more economically just society, but you're not willing to actually name the thing that's making it hard to organize that coalition, how do you build it?
It makes you think of some of the Bernie Sanders conflict with the Black Lives Matter folks this summer during the campaign.
Right. I think that his campaign narrative would be so much stronger. Not only had he led with that from the beginning, but if he would weave into his economic justice argument, this argument about, the thing that is keeping working class people from joining together to fight for a better deal in this country is racial division. And here's how the elite have sown it, and here's how the elite have manipulated us and pitted us against one another. And until white workers understand the common interest they have with black and brown workers in this country, they're going to continue to bank that psychological wage, meanwhile getting their ass kicked in the market, which is what we've seen.
How do you see your role and the role of white anti-racist activists at a moment like that? For example, with the Bernie Sanders Black Lives Matter confrontation, was there a role for you to play?
I think as a white anti-racist educator, my role is typically to follow the lead of leadership of color. And so when the Black Lives Matter folk did that, both at Netroots Nation and also at Bernie Sanders' talk, or the talk where Bernie was speaking in Seattle, I was very supportive of it because I feel as though what they were trying to do was shake up rooms, or in the case of the outdoor rally in Seattle, a group that was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly quote unquote progressive, but frankly, and I've been one of those white progressives in that kind of space who wasn't thinking enough about race early on and maybe didn't see the connections. And I think what BLM was saying, and certainly what I'm saying, trying to reinforce their narrative, not to usurp it from them, not to lead with it, but to reinforce it, is that there can't be economic justice in this country unless there's racial justice in this country.
And how do you answer people's question, white people's questions, well, I've got enough on my hands, that's not my problem?
Well, I think on the one hand, I think white folks, working people in particular, have a lot on their hands. But I would argue that much of what they have on their hands is because of this thing. In other words, there are lots of times I give these talks and always have that white person in the audience that says, well, I'm poor, I'm struggling, I can't pay my bills. And they're using that argument to sort of say, well, I don't have this thing you call white privilege because I'm struggling. And my response to them is, I have no doubt you're struggling. There are millions of people in this country who are. What I think is important to know is that part of why you're struggling and part of why the government does not insist on guaranteeing good unemployment insurance and good health care guaranteed and decent income support and job retraining is because we have this mentality that we have developed over the last 40 to 50 years, which says government programs are for those people. The irony being that now when you've got millions of white folks, particularly young white folks coming out of college, having a hard time finding work, the very safety net that they never thought about, and in fact, in many ways, helped to eliminate or argued against, is the one they need now.
So how do you keep accountable to movements? You, Tim Wise, you're an individual. You write, you talk, you lecture, you're an educator, as you said. Right. Have you ever worked in groups? Do you work with movement groups? And how do you remain accountable, particularly to groups of color?
Sure. Well, it's a hard task once you have a role that is more as a writer, let's say, or as an educator than as a grassroots activist. So as you mentioned, the setup, I've done a lot of community organizing going back to my early days in this work. And that was work that I did probably for the first 8 years of sort of professional activist work. Since that time, I've been on the road, and it's a different kind of organizing. I mean, the folks who trained me in New Orleans at the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, said to me when I got out there on the road, like, we want you to do this work. We want you to check in, though. And so I try to do that as often as I can, not only with folks from the Institute who I am in touch with off and on throughout the years, but also folks at the local level. One of the things that I'm wanting to do this year, actually getting back on the road for another academic year, speaking to student groups and also community organizations around the country, is having Black Lives Matter representatives and Surge representatives, which is showing up for racial justice, mostly a white anti-racist contingent, come to my talks, giving them the mic, letting them speak for a few minutes, letting the audience know the opportunities that the audience has to get involved, and also to table and distribute literature. So I want it to be a more collaborative effort.
Imagining the economics is kind of uncomfortable sometimes. I mean, you're making a living talking about your privilege.
Yeah, I mean, this is true. This is true. And, and I've written about that. I've talked about it. I talk about that a lot in White Like Me. I've talked about it in many of my speeches. Because I think transparency is the most important thing with that issue. There's no doubt that being white, being male, being straight, being cisgendered, being able-bodied, at least at this point in my life, thankfully, I have a plethora of advantages that come to me and that are in part responsible for where I am professionally and the fact that I can get heard. And it's one of those things that any of us who are in one or two of those positions, let alone 5 of them, have to think about as a matter of both transparency and accountability. Of course, the ultimate question then is, well, if you have those advantages, what do you do? Either you use them, try to use them productively and accountably, or you say, oh, I don't want to because that would be tacky and so I just won't do the work. That clearly is not a very good choice because we have to do the work, I think. But we do want to do it in a way that tries to give back, that tries to bring folks in and bring folks along, making sure that we're empowering their voices as well as our own.
Well, that's the next thing I wanted to ask you, and we don't have a lot more time, but Cornel West was on this program, and I asked him, how do you, as a person who's kind of a camera magnet at this point, when you go to someplace public, how do you deflect or share the spotlight? And he answered very concretely, how do you do it? Who are you bringing along? Are there people we should have in that chair next week?
Well, yeah, I mean, gosh, there's so many amazing activists, obviously, all over the country. Again, folks going back to the people I worked with in New Orleans, but now with the people in Black Lives Matter, the BYP 100, you have a bunch of different organizations out there, and Surge, the Showing Up for Racial Justice folks, who now I think have got 40 chapters or working on having 40 chapters around the country of white folks who are doing some really amazing things. I mean, going into neighborhoods, knocking on doors, standing on people's porch stoops to have conversations with other white folks about racism, white supremacy, and police accountability. That takes a lot of guts. I mean, that's not the kind of organizing that I remember white folks doing back in the 80s. I remember doing like door-to-door canvassing with Greenpeace, and we were scared to death to talk about whales and like air pollution. Imagine these young white folks who were, bravely going, I don't know if it's going to work or not. I don't know if it'll be effective, but it's really inspiring. And certainly what the Black Lives Matter activists and the various offshoots of that are doing. I mean, they're now coming up with, actual programs and plans to deal with police accountability at every every level that can be read on the internet that folks can download and distribute. The Malcolm X grassroots movement folks who are putting forth really concrete proposals for police accountability well beyond body cameras, actually empowering communities to make the decisions about who is going to police their streets. I mean, there's some really incredible work going on, most of it by folks of color, but also a lot of it by anti-racist white allies.
So final question, what's your advice? Talk to somebody out there who's like, I don't know if I want to get in the middle of this. A white person talking about racism gets a lot of hate. Yeah. Anybody talking about racism in America gets an enormous amount of hate. Yeah. Why should I be involved in this? Is this fun? You look pretty serious.
Well, you know what, I mean, reasonably, I don't know if I'm fun. I'm 47 years old. There's only so much fun. I only have so much time in the day. But no, but you know, I think there's a lot of, I don't know whether it's fun to fight for justice, but I know it's invigorating. I know it keeps you young. I know it keeps you sort of in the moment of trying to do something that's important and valuable and has integrity. And I think for those of us who are concerned about the things we see all around us, for those of us who are concerned about a country where millions of people apparently can be persuaded to vote for someone just because they're a billionaire and tells them that their problems as working class people are being caused by other working class people who happen to have darker skin, I would suggest there's a pretty important reason right now why people in this country, including white folks, had better rethink, or else we're going to end up replaying this drama that keeps us fighting one another over the pieces of a pie that none of us own. And I think if we want to get those pieces of the pie that working people have earned, we're going to have to fight together for them.
Or a brand new pie?
Maybe a brand new pie
All
would
right.
be better.
Thanks so much. And Under the Affluence is the book. There's a link at our website, and you can see our other interviews with Tim right there on our show. Thanks so much for coming in. It's great.
Thank you.
What are the issues faced by black youth? Kids Rethink New Orleans Schools is an organization led by young people in New Orleans, dedicated to letting young people be heard and make change. Here are two of the young people involved.
First, you freeze all of the burdens and heartache, and you never take them out again. Next, you will boil a pot of rage, prepping it for the grains of teardrops. Then you will drain the teardrops and add a cup of hospitality, given to me by my Southern grandmother. Next, you add the patience and wittiness of my many greats of grandparents, who were held down by chains and the oppressor long before this recipe was thought of. Soon after, you add the perseverance gifted to me by my mother. Then you cut into the stubbornness of my heart and season it with love, laughter, memories, and heartache. You bake it for 13 years and you get a medium rare type, but not quite well done. Good enough for the very few who know how to handle it, but not enough for the ones who want the basic. Finally, you add it on one dirty, vicious plate, ready to be devoured by many, but maybe admired by few.
In third grade, I was teased very often, specifically for my natural view of the world. For example, I don't believe in bad luck or superstitions. People told me things like, "You're stupid," or "How do you think bad things happen?" The answer is relatively simple. I believe God carefully plots out everything that happens in this world. One place that I always feel free in is Rethink. In Rethink, I can speak my mind and tell the interns anything that is bothering me. The Rethink interns do a great job at maintaining a safe environment and not yelling at students. At Rethink, we have community agreements that everyone agrees on to ensure a good community. black,
young
male,
woman,
teenager, student, learner.
learner. Being a black young woman, society sees me as simple-minded, ignorant, manipulative, abandoned, and ugly. As a teenager, I am seen as rebellious, lost or confused, inexperienced, and dramatic. It makes me feel rage, too familiar, the feeling just to explode, rage, too hard to hide. I watch TV and see the way women are portrayed, black women in particular. Most TV programs and music are degrading to women. I am and want to be seen as a black young woman who can do whatever when she puts her mind to it. Doubted by some, but always proves them wrong. I am capable of what anyone else can do, no matter how that person is identified. My first day at Rethink, I felt free. Here, I feel like my voice is being heard, even though I am a child. I feel safe to express my opinion without the fear of being judged. Freedom to me is no judgment or oppression towards myself or the ones I love. Also being able to say my opinion and how I feel no matter my age, gender, race, or color.
That was the film Greater Than the Sum from Foster Bear Films and the organization Kids Rethink New Orleans Schools. You can see more about their work at therethinkers.org and at our website. What do Palestine and Ferguson have in common? Security forces that stink. And I do mean that literally. Thanks to Missouri's open records law, it's been confirmed that the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department is one of a slew of U.S. city police forces to add a new Israeli crowd control spray to their arsenal. The spray, called Skunk, is a vile-smelling liquid that an Israeli company called Odor Tech has been developing with the help of the Israeli military. Israel's so-called defense forces have been firing skunk on Palestinians, trying it out, you might say, since 2008. A professor I know who got skunked in the West Bank this summer described the smell as a mix of sewage and excrement and rotting flesh. And it's impossible to wash off, he said, even after weeks back home. An Israeli spokesperson told the BBC it's a non-lethal, non-toxic alternative to plastic bullets and pepper spray. It's 100% eco-friendly, too. But that doesn't mean it's friendly. Human rights groups have videotape of Israeli water cannons soaking fields and farms and homes with skunk in the West Bank. Now it's here. Mistral Security, a firm based in Bethesda, Maryland, sells skunk in fire extinguisher or grenade form, and also in bulk skunk. 240-gallon barrels to treat large areas in a very short period of time, quote unquote. Applications include, but are not limited to, border crossings, correctional facilities, demonstrations, and sit-ins, says the company. And the stench can mark people for arrest, too. The smell of all this confirms the thesis of a new book by Jeff Halper, whom I first met 2 decades ago in the hills above Jerusalem. There he was directing the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Wars between states are largely a thing of the past, Halper says in his book, War Against the People. What's needed now are the counterinsurgency weapons that Israeli leads the world in. For skunk, there's apparently an antidote, a soap that the St. Louis PD has bought a good amount of. But is there an antidote for what Halper calls the globalization of Palestine? That's the question. Write to me, Laura at thelauraflandersshow.com. on the Laura Flanders Show. Rachel and Ellen Maripol, a mother and daughter, each seeking change, one through litigation, the other through fiction.
It seemed to me that, the starkest difference in power that exists in this country exists in the prison system.
Then Boots Riley of The Coup and the Street Sweeper Social Club on his personal history and the history of resistance.
Racism has a utility.
Welcome to our program. This week on the program, we talk with professor and author Greg Grandin about his new book,
Linking Cambodia and Vietnam to today's endless war.
Then later, we take a look at the U.S.-supported coup in Honduras in 2009.
At 28 years of age, Juan Chinchilla is the youngest member of MUCA's leadership. One of his responsibilities is documenting attacks against members of his community.